I've always considered myself a man of keen intuition, even more so after losing my wife and having to learn to be both father and mother at the same time. When Melissa came into my life, I confess it was a relief. She seemed too perfect, the kind who knows what to say, what to do, and how to act in any situation. Ava, my 6-year-old daughter, was still adjusting to her mother's absence, and I thought that perhaps, with time, she and Melissa would form a bond. But things started to change in a way that left me uneasy, and I had no idea of the hell I was about to discover within my own home. At first, it was just small things. Ava was quieter, slept poorly, and had deep dark circles under her eyes. I thought it was the new school, or perhaps unresolved grief. But then came the nighttime frights. She would wake up screaming, trembling, and when I asked what was wrong, she would just shrink back and say it was the bad story. One day I came home early from work and heard Melissa in Ava's room reading something, but the intonation, the tone, wasn't like a fairy tale. It was something colder, darker, and Ava, huddled in silence, seemed petrified. That's when the first spark of doubt ignited, and I would never be able to extinguish it again. That night changed everything. I started paying attention to details I had previously ignored. The way Ava looked away when Melissa spoke, the increasingly frightening drawings she brought home from school, and that persistent, almost physical feeling that something was profoundly wrong. What I didn't know was that the answer was closer than I imagined, and it would be far worse than any nightmare. Before we continue, comment below which city and country you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like. I remember exactly the day I decided to install the camera. Something inside me wouldn't leave me alone. An unease that grew every time I saw my daughter look at Melissa with disguised fear. It wasn't just sadness. It was terror, and it was eating me up inside. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that I was exaggerating, but Ava's behavior spoke louder. She avoided her own house, made up excuses to go to bed early, and whenever I asked her how her day had been, she gave automatic answers, as if she were reading from a script. That wasn't normal, and I needed to know the truth. At the electronics store, I asked for the most discreet camera possible. I wanted something small, that wouldn't attract attention, but that had good sound and image quality. The clerk didn't even question it. Maybe I wasn't the first parent to do this. I got home, and while Melissa was at the market, I installed the device on the bedside lamp in Ava's room. The camera was pointed directly at the bed, with clear audio. I didn't tell anyone. The only person who needed to know was me. Guilt was already gnawing at me for invading my daughter's privacy, but the fear of what might be happening was greater than any scruples. That night, I made a point of going out to work late and left Ava in Melissa's care as usual. I pretended everything was normal, but my heart was pounding as if I knew what was coming. When I got home, I waited for them to fall asleep, locked the office door, and connected the camera to my computer. The first few minutes of the video seemed normal. Melissa sitting beside the bed, book in hand, soft voice. But then, something changed. I felt my stomach churn. The gentleness gave way to a low, almost whispered voice, but full of venom. She spoke phrases that at first seemed part of the story, but I soon realized they were disguised threats. If you tell, no one will believe you. Your father will leave you alone if he finds out you're a bad girl. Ava cowered under the covers without saying a word, her eyes wide and full of fear. Melissa smiled as she spoke. A cold, satisfied smile. The scene seemed straight out of a horror movie, except it was real, and it was happening to my daughter inside our house. I paused the video before it finished. My whole body was trembling. Anger, guilt, horror. It was all mixed together. I wanted to burst through the bedroom door right then and there, confront Melissa, end it all. But something held me back. I knew I needed to think calmly. I needed proof. I needed to protect Ava without scaring her even more. I was facing a truth that could never be denied. And from that moment on, my life, and hers, would never be the same. The next morning I looked at Melissa as if it were the first time. There was something in her eyes that I had never noticed before. A glint of control, of silent superiority. As she made coffee and chatted about trivialities, everything inside me screamed. It was as if every word she uttered was a carefully constructed lie. I pretended to listen, but inside I was already plotting my next move. I couldn't simply expel her without formal proof. If she was capable of secretly threatening a child, what else would she be capable of if she felt cornered? Ava was still asleep, and I could barely look at her without guilt consuming me. I went to the school that afternoon unannounced. I asked to speak with Ava's teacher, Mrs. Carter. She greeted me with concern in her eyes, as if she had been expecting that visit for days. We sat in her office, and before I could even say anything, she said, "You noticed it too, didn't you?" My heart froze. She explained that Ava had been drawing frightening figures in her assignments, always depicting a woman with long hair and a blank face, that she was easily startled by loud noises, and sometimes cried for no apparent reason during class. Mrs. Carter said she had considered calling, but wanted to be sure first. That only confirmed what I already knew, and made everything even more urgent. I returned home determined. I couldn't wait any longer. I went to Ava's room, knelt beside her bed, and asked, as sweetly as possible, if she wanted to tell me something. She shook her head, but her eyes were brimming with tears. I held her hand and told her that nothing she said would make me love her any less, that I believed her. For a few seconds, she hesitated. Then she simply said, "She hates me, Dad." My heart broke. I couldn't hold back the tears. I knew there was much more there than she was ready to say, but it was enough to act. That night I watched 3 more recordings, each one more disturbing than the last. Melissa didn't yell. She didn't hit. What she did was more perverse. She planted fear like someone planting a poisonous seed. She said that ghosts came to take girls who cried, that Ava was responsible for her mother's death, that if she complained, she would be sent away from the house. All this with the sweet, calm voice of someone telling a fable. It was cruel in an almost unbelievable way. And the worst part? I had let that woman into our lives, trusted her, placed my daughter in her hands. The pain of that was almost unbearable. I spent the night awake watching, noting times, backing up the videos. I woke up with burning eyes and a broken heart. But the decision was made. It was going to end there. The next day, I called a lawyer, then a social worker. I showed them the recordings, asked for guidance. They told me that a formal complaint was the only way. I knew I would face a storm, but between protecting my daughter and maintaining an appearance of normalcy, I would choose Ava. Always. At any cost. The day I decided to confront Melissa, I made sure to keep every gesture under control. I couldn't let myself be consumed by anger, even though everything inside me screamed for immediate justice. I waited for Ava to go to school, checked that the recordings were saved in several places, and prepared myself as if for a silent war. When Melissa walked through the door that afternoon, I called her into the living room to talk. She came in calmly, smiling as if nothing was out of place. I, on the other hand, could barely hold her gaze without remembering every cruel whisper she had said to my daughter. But I took a deep breath. I had to do this calmly. I started by asking if she thought Ava was adjusting well. Her expression changed slightly, almost imperceptibly, but enough for me to notice. She said yes, that the girl was getting better little by little, and that some children take longer. I remained silent, just observing. Then I asked if she thought anything was bothering Ava. Melissa hesitated, crossed her arms, and said that Ava was very sensitive, that she still had unresolved issues with her mother's death. Her words hurt me more than she could have imagined. Using my daughter's grief as a shield for her own abuse was a coldness that made me nauseous. But I remained firm, waiting for the right moment. That's when I took my cell phone out of my pocket. I played one of the videos. The sound of her voice filled the room. "If you tell, no one will believe you." Melissa paled. For a second, I thought she was going to faint, but she quickly recovered and said it was a game, that she was playing with Ava, that I didn't understand the context. Typical of someone who manipulates, who distorts everything until it seems like the victim is to blame. But this time it wouldn't work. I had the evidence and the courage. When she realized I wouldn't believe any of her excuses, she changed tactics. She started crying. She said she loved me, that she had done everything for us, that Ava never really liked her. That sudden victimhood was repulsive. Every tear she shed seemed rehearsed, strategic. I remained silent, only saying that the police would be called. She became desperate. She started screaming, saying I was destroying her life. But the only life being destroyed there was my daughter's, and I was fighting to rebuild it piece by piece. I called the police that same night. I handed over all the videos, all the statements. I filed a full police report. Melissa was taken from our house in handcuffs, still screaming that it was all a misunderstanding. Ava was asleep, protected by not having to witness that scene. When I closed the door behind the police officers, I felt a different silence fill the house. It was no longer the silence of fear. It was the beginning of a peace. Fragile, yes, but real. And it was only the first step on a long road ahead. In the days following Melissa's arrest, the house felt like a recently emptied battlefield. The rooms were intact, but the air was thick, heavy. Ava walked the hallways as if treading on unfamiliar ground. And I didn't know where to begin. I had won a silent war, but now another was beginning, rebuilding my daughter's trust. On the first morning, she asked me if Melissa would come back. I firmly replied no, that no one would ever hurt her again. She simply nodded and continued drawing. This time the drawing was of the two of us, her and me, holding hands, smiling. It was then that I understood that perhaps there was still light at the end of this tunnel. I contacted a child therapist recommended by the school itself. We scheduled an appointment for the following week. I was nervous. I didn't know if Ava would open up, if she would trust someone from the outside. But to my surprise, she agreed to go. She was silent the whole way to the office. But upon entering the colorful room, with toys and children's books, her eyes lit up for a moment. The therapist, a sweet and firm woman named Dr. Helena, told me that the process would be slow, that emotional traumas, especially in children, require time, patience, and above all, stability. I promised to offer all of that, for as long as it took. Ava started talking in the sessions. Little by little, she revealed details that made my stomach churn. Phrases Melissa used to say. Moments when she felt completely alone, even with me nearby. It was as if she had lived in a bubble of silence and fear that was now, little by little, beginning to burst. I blamed myself, of course. I wondered how I hadn't noticed sooner, how I let this happen under my own roof. But the therapist gently told me that I had also been manipulated, that recognizing and acting even late was what saved my daughter. I tried to believe that. I still try. Over time, small changes began to appear. Ava started playing with her favorite toys again, began sleeping without needing the light on, and even asked me to make pancakes on Saturdays like we used to. Each simple gesture from her was like a gift, but also a reminder of what we had almost lost. I decided to transform the house. I painted her room with new colors, changed the furniture, let her choose the wall stickers. It was more than decoration. It was a ritual of new beginnings, a symbolic way of saying, this place is yours, and you're safe now. The school also helped. Mrs. Carter remained attentive, and the principal was understanding when I explained the situation. They offered psychological support, tutoring, and even a discussion group with other children who had faced loss. Ava began to smile more, to lift her head when walking, and even with invisible scars, she seemed lighter. I knew the road ahead would be long, that the marks of the past wouldn't disappear so easily. But for the first time in months, I felt hope, and that, in itself, was a miracle. I didn't expect things to go back to normal so soon. In fact, I didn't even know what normal meant to us anymore. Every routine that used to be automatic, waking Ava up, making breakfast, taking her to school, now carried a different weight. I tried to keep things light, but the truth is I was still afraid. Afraid she would have nightmares, that she would regress, that I would fail again. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night just to check if she was sleeping well, and in many of those moments I would find Ava awake, silent, staring at the ceiling, not crying, not speaking, just waiting for something to pass. Dr. Helena said that these silences were part of the process, that Ava was relearning to trust, not only me, but the world around her. She still drew, almost always scenes from what she had lived through, mixed with elements of fantasy. Monsters hidden in the closet, houses with locked doors, shadows with eyes. But she also drew flowers, birds, and a male figure that was clearly me, always by her side. These drawings were maps of what she felt, and I kept them all, as if they were fragments of her heart trying to rebuild itself. They said much more than words ever could. With the legal process underway, I received calls from the police station, was summoned to testify, and had to relive everything more than once. Each time I told the story, I felt like a piece of me was being ripped away, but it was also a reminder of why I was doing this. Melissa, through her lawyer, tried to deny everything. He said the videos were misinterpreted, that Ava was a child with too fertile an imagination. But the evidence was clear, and this time the system seemed to be on our side. Even so, the anxiety increased with each scheduled hearing. I couldn't relax until everything was settled in a suit. We received a summons for a preliminary hearing. Melissa would be there. The idea of seeing her again disgusted me, but Ava didn't need to go. That was my only priority. In court, I saw Melissa enter as if she were the victim. Calm gaze, sober clothes, posture of someone who had done nothing. When the videos were shown, the silence in the room was absolute. The judge frowned. The prosecutor looked at me as if apologizing for us having to go through this. It was clear that her mask was slipping. And although I knew that no justice can erase the trauma, at least she would no longer be able to hide behind a smile. Leaving the courthouse, I sat in the car and cried. I cried like I hadn't cried since my wife's funeral. It wasn't just relief. It was pain, guilt, exhaustion. But it was also the certainty that I had done the right thing, that despite all the mistakes and delays, I was there for her, for Ava, and that even if everything fell apart again, I would rebuild as many times as necessary, because being a father, I discovered, isn't about protecting from falls. It's about holding her hand firmly after the ground has already broken. In the days following the hearing, Ava seemed calmer. It was as if, even without understanding all the details, she knew that something important had changed. She started playing alone in the yard again, something she hadn't done in months. She would sit on the grass, invent stories with her dolls, and speak softly as if narrating secret tales. I watched from the window, trying not to interfere. It was her world rebuilding itself, little by little at her own pace. At night, there were still moments of heavy silence. But now, when I covered her with the sheet and told her everything was all right, she would look at me with a small smile. And that was enough for me. One afternoon, Ava asked me if she could visit her mother's grave. It had been a while since we'd been there. I thought it might still be too soon, but I trusted her instincts. We bought flowers, the same ones my wife liked, and went to the cemetery. Ava walked, holding my hand, firm, fearless. When she reached the gravestone, she knelt down, placed the flowers, and stood silently. Then she turned to me and said, "Mom would never let Melissa hurt me." I just hugged her. I stood there, my heart aching, feeling how much that child had already faced, more than many adults would ever face. And yet, there she was, standing. I decided to write a letter, not to Melissa, but to myself, a plea for forgiveness, a promise. I put everything I felt on paper, the pain, the guilt, the fear, the determination. I promised never again to ignore my intuition, never again to give up observing my daughter with the eyes of my heart, that from now on, I would be more than present. I would be a shield, a refuge, truth. Not out of obligation, but because I finally understood that loving also means knowing how to fight, and that silence, when it comes from fear, is a cry that needs to be heard. Dr. Helena said that Ava had entered the emotional reconstruction phase. It was still too early to talk about overcoming the situation, but the signs were positive. She started making new friends at school, wanted to learn to ride a bike without training wheels, and even asked to sleep at her cousin's house next month. Simple, everyday things. But for us, they represented immense achievements. Each of her small victories was a reminder of how worthwhile it was to have acted when I did. I knew I would still face difficult memories, but now they no longer had the same power as before. They were just that, memories. The present was being written in different colors. One day, Ava told me she wanted to write her own book, that it would be about a brave girl who faced shadows no one else could see. She said that this girl would discover, in the end, that the shadows were afraid of the light that came from within her. I couldn't resist. I picked her up and told her that this was the most beautiful story I had ever heard. She laughed and said, "You can be the knight who protects her." And I replied, with my heart at peace for the first time in a long time, "I always have been." The news of Melissa's conviction arrived by phone one ordinary afternoon. I was preparing dinner when the lawyer called. She had been found guilty of psychological abuse and placed under a permanent protective order, prohibiting any contact with Ava. The sentence didn't seem proportional to the pain she caused, but I knew that the most important thing wasn't the punishment itself. It was the closing of a cycle. Ava would never again have to live under that gaze disguised as affection. Never again would she have to hear threats disguised as stories. When I hung up the phone, I went to her room, hugged her tightly, and told her we were free. She just smiled, and for the first time, without a shadow behind her eyes. We started creating new rituals. At breakfast, we had a gratitude round where each of us would share something good from the previous day. At night, we invented stories together, but now with happy endings. Stories where brave girls and warrior fathers overcame invisible monsters. Stories where love was always stronger than fear. These moments weren't just fun, they were rebuilding. Brick by brick, we were reforming our relationship, our home, our world. I discovered each day new ways to be a father, and Ava discovered little by little that she was no longer alone in facing life. I received invitations from support groups for single parents. I hesitated at first, but I realized that sharing what we've been through could help other families. I told my story at one of these meetings without going into sensitive details, but making it clear that we need to be attentive to the signs, however subtle they may be. Many people came to talk to me afterward, moved, saying they never imagined that something like this could happen in a normal home. But it does happen. It happened to me, and it can happen to anyone who doesn't listen to their own instincts. Ava, now 7 years old, began drawing fewer monsters and more gardens. One day, she showed me a drawing where we were planting a tree together. I asked what it was. She said, "It's a magic tree. It grows with love and becomes a home for those who have lost their inner home." I was speechless. Children have a wisdom that we forget over time, and at that moment, I was certain that despite everything, we were on the right path. The roots we planted with pain now supported new branches of hope. One night before going to sleep, Ava asked me if I was still sad about everything that had happened. I answered honestly, sometimes yes, but that it hurt less each time, because we were together. She looked at me and said, "We won, didn't we?" And I replied, "Yes, my love, we won." Because winning, I learned, isn't about erasing the past. It's about being able to look ahead without fear and teaching those we love to do the same. Time passed, and even though some wounds still exist, they stopped bleeding. Today, when I look at Ava running in the yard with her hair blowing in the wind, laughing loudly with her friends, I realize how much she has rebuilt herself. It wasn't quick nor easy. Each step required patience, presence, and a faith I didn't even know I had. She still asks, from time to time, if all of that was real. I say yes, but that what's most real of all is how strong she was, and that sometimes bad people wear beautiful masks, but the truth always comes out. And that love, when it's true, protects like a shield. I wrote a diary entry about everything we went through, not to relive the pain, but to remember how we overcame it. One day when she's older, I'll give this diary to Ava. I want her to know it wasn't her fault, that her silence was understandable, that even on the days she seemed alone, I was there, trying to understand what my eyes couldn't see. I want her to grow up knowing that we don't have to accept what hurts us, no matter how well disguised it is, and that trusting yourself, your own instincts, can be the first step in saving those you love. These days, we're back to traveling on weekends. Simple places, countryside, beaches, small towns, but each trip is like rediscovering the world. Sometimes she takes my hand in the car and says, "You're the best dad in the world." I don't answer. I just squeeze her hand back. Because it's not about being the best. It's about being there. About doing what needs to be done when no one else is watching. About not looking away. About being a refuge when everything falls apart. Recently, Ava asked to adopt a puppy. She said she wanted to take care of someone the way I took care of her. Together, we chose a rescued puppy with the sweetest eyes I've ever seen. She calls him Saul, son, because, according to her, he chases away any shadow. And I understood at that moment that we were ready for a new chapter, that even after the darkest night, dawn always arrives. And that light sometimes comes from the smallest sources, like a child's smile, a small hand holding yours, or a dog wagging its tail at the front door. Ava's story taught me to listen. It taught me that danger doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers softly, right under our roof. And that, when you're a parent, love needs to be more than a feeling. It needs to be action, choice, courage. I failed for a while, but I had the chance to correct it, to fight for her, to save her. And in the end, maybe she saved me too. Because today I'm more whole, more attentive, stronger, and all of this, and because I learned to listen to my daughter's silence.